For over 40 years, Star Wars has been a household name, and we as fans have been lucky enough to receive a constant flow of new Star Wars content through the years. Everyone has had a different experience with Star Wars and fallen in love with the franchise at different times and for different reasons. Whether you grew up with the originals, the prequels, sequels, or anywhere in between, there was always something to be excited about in the world of Star Wars. But today, I'm going to be looking deeper into the release history of Star Wars to determine when exactly was the best time to be a Star Wars fan. Wikipedia describes the 1970s as a decade that began on January 1st, 1970 and ended December 31st, 1979. A time where one's popularity was based on what character you had on your lunchbox, and the latest advancements in video games look like this. Also in the 70s, in November 1976 to be exact, George Lucas released his book, Star Wars: From the Adventures of Luke Skywalker, introducing the world to a fun, exciting galaxy far, far away, 6 months before the release of the first Star Wars film. It even stated on the back of the book, soon to be a spectacular motion picture from 20th Century Fox. Before the release of the film in May 1977, the book had sold over 500,000 copies. Whilst the book was a novelisation of the 1977 movie, it did differ slightly, even expanding on ideas that appear in later movies, mentioning Senator Palpatine declaring himself as Emperor. The signature, a long time ago, in a galaxy far, far away, doesn't appear in the opening pages of this book, but it instead reads, another galaxy, another time. Thankfully they changed it because I don't think another galaxy, another time would have caught on as much. One thing that was included in the book, but heartbreakingly wasn't adapted in the movie, was Chewie receiving his well-deserved medal after the defeat of the Death Star, something he was robbed from in the first movie. Speaking of the first movie, on Wednesday the 25th of May 1977, men and women of all ages were treated to the true revolutionising spectacle that was Star Wars. The film was released initially only in 30 theatres in North America. No one expected this movie to run for more than 2 weeks, and they would have considered themselves lucky just to break even. But to a lot of people's surprise at the time, including George Lucas's, Star Wars was huge. There were lines of people going all up pavements in Los Angeles, all queuing up to see the space opera everyone was talking about. Not long after, Star Wars was playing in over 1,000 theatres in the US, in many for several months, and over 50 ran Star Wars continuously for over a year. Even having a big special event on May 25th, 1978 to celebrate 1 year of Star Wars. The film received critical acclaim, being described by critics as an almost out-of-body experience. Alan Dean Foster, the man who helped George Lucas bring his galaxy to life, ghostwriting the first novel, then wrote a second novel, Splinter of the Mind's Eye. That released in 1978 and was the idea for a low-budget sequel to the original Star Wars if it wasn't a financial success. Taking place on a misty planet to reduce sets and background costs, and having very simple action so the adaptation wouldn't be too reliant on special effects. Han Solo and Chewbacca were also absent from the story, as Harrison Ford hadn't signed on to do any sequels. Another book was planned to follow the events of Splinter of the Mind's Eye, but fortunately for George Lucas and audiences alike, by the time of the book's release, Star Wars was considered a huge financial success, which meant George Lucas abandoned the project, now able to focus on his vision for his big budget sequel that we all know and adore today, The Empire Strikes Back. But more on that later. Splinter of the Mind's Eye was released as a novel and formed part and marked the beginning of the Star Wars expanded universe. Also around this time, Marvel Comics started releasing their series of Star Wars comics. Every boy and girl of all ages had the same thing on their Christmas list in 1977, with George Lucas's release of Star Wars action figures. But Lucas was unprepared for the demand and was unable to build enough stock in time for Christmas. They instead sold what they called an early bird certificate package, which was basically a pre-order for the figures that had not been made yet. The certificate was good for 4 Star Wars action figures, which were Luke Skywalker, Princess Leia, Chewbacca, and R2-D2, which were released in 1978. After the initial release, the catalogue of toys increased, now including Han Solo, Obi-Wan Kenobi, C-3PO, Jawa, Sand People, Stormtrooper, Death Squad Commander, and of course, Darth Vader. Kenner Products would continue to release more characters and vehicles in the upcoming years. Christmas time 1978, George Lucas released Star Wars Holiday Special, a TV special set after the events of the first movie, where Chewbacca is trying to get to his home planet of Kashyyyk to celebrate Life Day. You can find it on YouTube. The whole thing is very strange and difficult to believe it came from the same minds that brought us the original. But the whole original cast returns, even James L. Jones as Darth Vader. As well as all these returning characters, there is an animated feature that followed the special where a bounty hunter by the name of Boba Fett makes his first appearance in the Star Wars universe. The special itself was met with terrible reception and was never rebroadcasted. The entire Star Wars team tried their best to make it as if it never happened. A review of the special in 1978 read, "I'm not convinced the special wasn't ultimately written and directed by a sentient bag of cocaine," even being ranked number 1 on the list of 100 dumbest events in television history. However, the animated short, The Story of a Faithful Wookiee, featuring Boba Fett, was liked by fans and can be watched today on Disney+. Kenner Products even offered a mail-in service featuring the bounty hunter, where 4 proofs of purchase of any of Kenner's products could be redeemed for a free Boba Fett figure, released in the anticipation of The Empire Strikes Back. In 1979, Del Rey Publishing released the first 2 books in the Han Solo Adventures trilogy, following Han and Chewie taking place a year before the original movie. And that was pretty much it for the 70s. An exciting introduction to the franchise, the movies, and the expanded universe, with promises of what was to come. Far from the most jam-packed decade of Star Wars content, but overlooking one not-to-be-mentioned TV special, it was still a very exciting time to be a Star Wars fan in the late 70s. The highly anticipated The Empire Strikes Back hit cinemas in May 1980, 3 years after the original. Still, to this day, this is considered by most to be the best Star Wars movie, even one of the best sci-fi fantasy movies. But when it was first released, it was met with mixed reviews. Audiences were not a fan of this movie's darker and mature themes, being critical of how different the movie felt from the light-hearted adventure that was the original. During production, the movie's title was Star Wars Episode 2, The Empire Strikes Back. But as George wrote and developed his story, he actually started visualizing what came before. It was actually when he decided that Darth Vader would be Luke's father, making Anakin and Vader one in the same, that he then announced to fans that there would be a trilogy of prequels expanding on the events that led up to the rise of the Empire and the fall of the Republic, then renaming the project Star Wars Episode 5, The Empire Strikes Back. But The Empire Strikes Back wasn't the first bit of Star Wars media fans were given in the 80s. In fact, just 3 months prior, in February 1980, Luke Skywalker, along with C-3PO, Chewbacca, and R2-D2, starred in a Star Wars-centered Muppet show where Mark Hamill, Luke Skywalker's cousin, guest stars. 1980 also saw the release of the final book in the Han Solo Adventures trilogy. In 1981, the original Star Wars was re-released, now with the addition of the subtitle Episode 4, A New Hope. Then, just a couple years later, the conclusion of the trilogy, Star Wars Episode 6, The Return of the Jedi, was released in theaters in 1983. This movie was very well received at its time of release, giving fans a satisfying ending to Luke, Leia and Han's story. And with promises of a prequel trilogy to follow, fans were very excited for the future of Star Wars. Or the past of Star Wars, I guess. But then, nothing. No news on the prequel trilogy? Nothing. 3 books following Lando Calrissian met with mixed reviews, but besides that, nothing. There was speculation following the news of George Lucas's divorce that he had taken a break, but it wasn't until 1987 George Lucas officially came out and stated the production of the last 2 movies had burnt him out and as a result will not be returning to make the promised prequel trilogy. So the hopes and dreams of fans ever seeing what happened to Anakin Skywalker and what the infamous Clone Wars looked like would sadly going to stay just that. Dreams. Marvel Comics ended their run of Star Wars comics in 1987, and Kenner Products Star Wars figures had been discontinued since 1985. Although there was no big-budget Star Wars movies, a number of animated shows and low-budget live-action movies came out, most featuring the adorable Ewoks introduced in Return of the Jedi, and also a C-3PO and R2-D2 show that ran for only 1 season and a special, titled Droids. The movies, Caravan of Courage and its sequel, The Battle for Endor, were both met with a mild response, with everyone finding them a bit bland, offering nothing new or exciting to the Star Wars canon, and as a result, they have been more or less forgotten in today's media. The 2 shows, Ewoks and Droids, were both very kid-friendly, the former being referred to as Smurfs, but with the Lucasfilm's branding. Both shows fizzled out of existence quickly, leaving audiences in the late 80s with nothing new from Star Wars. It seemed to most that Star Wars would stay just being an incredible trilogy of movies, and all the unanswered questions would have been left to audiences' imaginations. By 1990, Star Wars was something of the past. No noteworthy content had been released for the last 5 years. But then, in May 1991, Timothy Zahn released Heir to the Empire, the first book in what today we know as the Thrawn trilogy, reintroducing fans to Star Wars, showing what happened to Luke, Leia and Han since the events of Episode 6. Even introducing one of, if not the best, non-Sith villain of the franchise in Thrawn. This book reignited the spark in Star Wars fans' hearts, and it didn't stop there. Later that year, a new comic series called Dark Empire started its run, and then Star Wars video games published by LucasArts started appearing, the likes of Super Star Wars X-Wing, and Star Wars Rebel Assault. And by 1994, the Star Wars fandom had been revived, through comics, video games, and most impactfully, novels. But it didn't stop there. Novels like The Truce at Bakura, and video games such as the first Star Wars first-person shooter, Dark Forces, kept the interest in Star Wars burning hot. Even Kenner Products released a new line of Star Wars toys for the first time in 10 years. George Lucas, seeing this resurrection in Star Wars fandom, got inspired to go back on his word. He still had no interest in continuing the story after the events of Return of the Jedi, but the ideas of what came before were always on his mind. So in 1994, George Lucas announced that he was working on a new movie. Star Wars Episode 1, The Beginning. The first in a trilogy of prequels exploring, as he put it, the tragedy examining Darth Vader's origins. Star Wars was in full force by the mid-late 90s, with multiple novel releases every year, including the first of the X-Wing saga of books, which is my personal favourite Star Wars novel series. In 1997, they re-released the original trilogy, now with added scenes and sequences, along with updated visual and sounds, adding new CGI elements that wouldn't have been possible in the 70s. Some of them were welcome additions. Some of them unnecessary.
Someone was in the pod. The tracks go off in this direction. Look, sir, droids. Someone was in the pod. The tracks go off in this direction. Look, sir, droids.
And even some which were just downright bad additions. In September 1998, the first trailer came out for the upcoming Star Wars movie, revealing the new title, Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace. Along with its stacked cast, Liam Neeson, Ewan McGregor, Natalie Portman, to say the excitement for this movie was high is a drastic understatement. Being released in May 1999, there were lines up and down walkways unlike anything most theatres had seen before. Companies had to close on the opening day of the film because so many workers had taken the day off to watch the movie. The movie opened to a record-breaking opening weekend. The movie was a massive milestone in what was to become the next phase of Star Wars. The reception was mixed. Many fans loving it on their initial viewing, being overwhelmingly excited about this new era of Star Wars may have played into their reviews. However, movie critics weren't so generous in their reviews, being critical on the movie's script and characters. Burdened by exposition and populated with stock characters, The Phantom Menace gets the Star Wars prequels off to a bumpy, albeit visually dazzling, start. Although a mixed reception, there was no doubting its financial success, smashing records worldwide. In the UK, it held the record for highest grossing movie in its opening weekend. Sadly, it only held that record for a few months, only to be surpassed by Toy Story 2 later that year. But it was clear to see people were still in love with Star Wars and couldn't wait to see what would happen next. 1999 also saw the collaboration between Star Wars and LEGO, a theme that would later go on to become one of LEGO's most iconic. The first Star Wars LEGO set ever released was an X-Wing, along with Luke, R2-D2, Biggs, and even a Rebel Technician minifigure. This was the start of the many LEGO sets that were to come out. That year also saw the release of a number of Phantom Menace sets, as well as a few iconic vehicle sets from the original trilogy. All the minifigures at this time supported LEGO's iconic yellow skin. And with that we reach not only the end of the decade, but the end of the century. But we have covered only the beginning of Star Wars. There is still a lot more to come. But we will cover all that in a part 2 of this video, which will be linked down below once it's been uploaded. But for now, thanks for watching.